Well, welcome to day 2 of Build Stuff. I'm really excited to be here. I've never been to Lithuania before, so I'm looking forward to really exploring Vilnius and learning about the history, and yeah, that's going to be really, really cool. So, also, I realize I have to introduce myself. My name's Julie Lerman, and if it's not obvious, I come from the US. Well, maybe you thought I was from Canada, but I'd have to say and a boot. That's Canadian. I live, in Vermont, which is a tiny little state in the Northeast, and we had a big snowstorm. I almost didn't make it to the airport to get here. But then because I live in a small place, I had to take 3 airplanes to get here. And, well, I'm going to be talking about legacy software today, and I have some history. I've been programming for over 30 years, so I do have some experience. I actually have software that I wrote a long time ago that I still support. So, and I know that in this conference, there's lots of people talking about how to get away from old software, how to move from monoliths to microservices and all of that stuff. But what I want to talk about is in that in-between time, right? Because we can't all move that quickly, 20 years, whatever. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And, pushing the wrong button there. So I thought this was kind of funny. I did this talk a few months ago, and I don't know how many people here are .NET focused developers. So I was doing it like 2 days or a day or something after .NET Core 3.0 was officially released. So I thought it was funny to just do a little Twitter poll to see what people thought I might be talking about, right? I didn't say that it was a legacy app. And I just thought it was pretty telling that people who know me on Twitter kind of guessed that I might be talking about old software. So anyway, legacy apps, right? I mean, how is it? Can you say, I'm working on a legacy app without kind of also saying ugh every time, either before or after? So what I want to do today is help you not feel ugh about legacy every single time, right? So you can feel better about your work, going into work every day if you're not getting to work on the new shiny stuff all the time. And not only to try to give you some perspective on it, but also give you some strategies for dealing with that. Even if it's, you're not going to start working on those microservices, the things you can do to that legacy software to get it ready for the future, for that time when you are able to start evolving it or just delete it, who knows. So first what I want to do, and also I think this is a great thing in the morning, to give everybody a little exercise. It's not a lot, it's just standing. So what I would love is if everybody who's working on software, currently working on software that is at least a year old, if you could stand up so we could see who's working on software. Right. I mean, we know, the day after it's released, it's legacy. So that's like everybody. There's a few people who are sitting. Oh, stay standing. Sorry. I told you it's exercise. No jumping jacks, though. So there are lucky few who might be, they're sitting because maybe they're working on something brand new, which is, sometimes kind of enviable. So stay standing if your software is at least 5 years old that you're working on. And look around the room. So whenever you go into work and you go, every single other developer on the planet is working on the newest, latest, greatest thing that just got released yesterday, that's not really the case, is it? Okay. Stay standing if your software is 10 or more years old. Okay, so we got no more 20-year-olds standing, right? Us old people need more exercise. All right, so again, look around, you're not alone. One more time. Oh my God, I'm the only one left standing? No, a few of us. But interestingly, I think I'm the oldest one left standing. Because what I'm supporting is software that I wrote a really long time ago, which is really funny because some days I'm also like researching and writing about or helping clients with stuff that isn't even released yet, the newest, latest, greatest, bleeding edge stuff. And I'm, working along on it, and then I get an email from my client, and they're like, we could really use this, capture this new piece of information in our VB6 app. Does anybody here know what VB6 is? Have you ever heard of it? Okay, I'm gonna try again. Fox Pro? Wait, 2.6. 2.6, right? We got one person in the room. So I am still, even though I'm like this bleeding edge work, I still have to support a Fox Pro 2.6 app. So this is just a smattering of what I do when I get one of those emails. The first thing I have to do is just get it off my chest. And, that's what I use Twitter for. I'm like, oh my God, I have to stop working on, bleeding edge, whatever, and go work on my 22-year-old Fox Pro app that will not die. So that's good. I'm solo, so I'm not going to get fired. And people have asked, oh my God, is your client on Twitter? Are they going to get upset that you're, ranting about this? And they, they're not, but they also know. I mean, I love them, right? I've been working with them for all these years. We have a really good relationship, and they know that it's a problem supporting this old stuff. Also, this happens when I tweet, right? Like, I'm just getting it off my chest. I'm not looking for advice, but I do get people saying, you should drop your client, just walk away from the project. Like, how could I do that? I mean, I have an amazing relationship with them, and they're totally dependent on me. I don't want to see them just go out of business because I can't support their needs. Or, go ahead and just rewrite it. Well, 20 years ago, yes, we could write software on our own. The scope of things that were available to us and things we had to do was much smaller, right? But you can't do that on your own anymore. I port it to VB.net. I don't need to respond to that. And then, of course, people are like, oh, you can hire us to rewrite it. I'm like, no, that's just not how it's going to work. Anyway, so I think it's really important to look at what this word is, legacy. And I don't know if Michael Feathers is here, who does a lot of, he's written some important books on legacy and talks a lot about legacy software. He was joking last night that I need to add TM trademark after the word legacy every time I use it today. So what is this word legacy mean? So when I think of legacy, this is what I think, right? The Vilnius Cathedral. Now that's the kind of legacy I want to leave behind. Oh, look at this wonderful thing to share. I don't really think about my 22-year-old apps. These to me are not the legacy that I want to leave behind. They shouldn't be even used anymore, right? My mom is a writer. Her first book when she was 30 got nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, right? That is a legacy. Yeah, I've written a few books too, but these are doorstops, right? They're not, to me, this is not the kind of legacy I want to leave. I mean, yeah, she wrote some nice books, but nobody can use, they're totally irrelevant now. Unless you want to go buy it, that's fine. You need a good doorstop, right? So not every old tech book is legacy, is what we, a non-legacy, right? Here are two books that these are an amazing legacy by these authors, and they're still totally relevant. Again, Michael Feathers working effectively with legacy code, and Eric Evans, domain-driven design. These are amazing legacies and will be relevant for a very long time, as a matter of fact. So yeah, make fun of my tech books, but that's a little different. So Michael actually, in his book, had defined, it's kind of notable, people quote this all the time. The way he defined legacy was it's code without tests, right? That's what he wrote in 2004. And he has said, and if you were to talk to him today, which you can because he's here as a speaker, He said he didn't really mean for that to be a immutable definition. And people have constantly gone back to that definition he made in 2004. Today, he says he's much more involved in thinking about and researching on socio-technical aspects, how teams and code structure relate to each other. And that's really important to him. And his perspective on what legacy software is has evolved. And he says it's more now when the team turns over faster than the code. Of course, when the team is just you, that's a little different. Mine hasn't evolved in that way because, I don't think anybody wants to try to look at that code. I don't want anybody to see that code. So Andrea Goulet and Scott Ford are another pair of people. They work together. They're also married. But they talk about legacy a lot. And they describe it as artifacts without communication. They think of it almost like archaeology, right? There's no communication there. So maybe tests are one form of communication, or maybe code comments. And I know, that's a touchstone for some people. You shouldn't have comments. You should be able to understand the code by reading it. But those are forms of communication. So if you are looking or inherit some legacy software and it's just the code and there's nothing else to help guide you through what's going on there. I do want to give a shout out also to the podcast that Andrea and Scott have called Legacy Code Rocks. I haven't updated this, but they come out like almost every week and they have amazing conversations with people. And it's not all about how to keep legacy code going all the time. There's all kinds of different perspectives. And interesting, I really like another thing that Andrea talks about with respect to maintaining legacy code. She talks about it as though you're remodeling a house instead of just totally knocking the house down and starting from scratch, because there's still foundation and all kinds of good things in the house. So possibly remodeling is a great way to approach handling legacy software. So I think there's a lot to gain from this podcast. There's also like the dictionary definition of legacy code, which is basically code it's old, it's hard to update, right? Hard to work with, but it's hard to change it because there's so many people using it, right? And you don't want to it's not even rock the boat. You just don't want to break stuff. People are too dependent on it. So that's another perspective on that. I also like this a lot, again, from Eric Evans, and he also brings a lot of years of experience, so he's not always talking about only domain-driven design. But he said this at Explore DDD earlier this year. He said, we don't honor legacy code enough, right? And I think about some of the responses I do get, like when I rant about having to work on my legacy code myself on Twitter. Yes, people are like, oh, ditch the client. But there are also people who say, you wrote software that's still running a company? Like you wrote it over 20 years ago and it's still doing its job. Like, yeah, that's something to kind of have some respect for. But this is a little closer to how we think about legacy code. I'm just gonna, fix it. And you can find so many, tweets of people making fun of legacy code, right? But yeah, I don't think we do honor it enough. This is a really important thing to think about, right? And people have to remind me about this sometimes too. There was a thread of people asking, how do you think of your legacy code, right? And, you have a positive outlook on it. And people were calling it legendary, right? Classic, vintage, heritage code. I like heritage code. But this is the most important thing about it. It's still the moneymaker, right? There's a lot of old software out there running some major things in this world, right? airlines are running on old code. Banks, hospitals, it's a little scary, right, when you think about it. But those, this is another reason why people are afraid to touch it. Like, this is a really big, important thing. And some of that code's really old, even older than me. This, like there was this recently, the 60th anniversary of COBOL. And Grady Booch pointed out there's still 200 billion lines of COBOL that are still running and still running companies and still running the world, which is amazing. So they still work. But he also made another really interesting point, which is it doesn't just die, right? It doesn't just fade away on its own. You have to actively, well, he says kill it, but you have to actively deal with it and do something about it because it's not going to go away. With my client, for example, I say, oh, I wish that software would just die, but it can't just die until there's something to replace it, right? That's really, really important, right? And then there's, the question of evolving software or just starting from scratch. I mean, if you think about .NET Core and EF Core, I spent a lot of time with the Entity Framework Core. When they went from original .NET and original Entity Framework to the core versions, total rewrite from the ground up, right? Because they needed to, there was a lot of code in there that was preventing them from moving on, and they wanted to have code that would follow modern software practices and be easy to maintain and easy to add on to, right? So there is definitely reason to do that. So these are things that not only I hear when people learn that I'm still supporting legacy code, because another perspective of that is that I'm still making my client be dependent on that legacy code, right? And whether it's me or you working on your legacy code, you might be hearing, you should be working on modern stuff, right? Like, oh, this is terrible for your career, right? Or you should be solving new problems. You want to, work on something new instead of these old problems, like, because the world's moved on. But the hardest one for me to hear is that I'm being irresponsible by leaving my client in the situation where they have all this legacy code, plus they're totally dependent on me. So I just want to address these kind of one by one. So the first, that you should be using the latest, technology when you're writing your software. So going back to Andrea Goulet and Scott Ford, one of the interesting things that they consider is, you could be working on old code, but you could still take advantage of new tools, right? When you're working on that code. And I actually evolved to doing this as well. And another thing, not just about that the fact that that code is old, but what about your skills, right? Like, who would want to start a new job and like have to learn VB6 in order to support the software, right? Because that's not, if you, from one perspective, like, oh, that's not really going to be good for my career. On the other hand, there's a lot of old VB6 software out there. If you're good at it, you can get a lot of work trying to help keep it going, right? But even if you're not at work getting an opportunity to learn new things and work with new modern technology, you can still make an investment in your career, and I understand if people have families, right? Like, so, you leave work, you want to spend time with your family and not just be like working more. But it is really, I think, a very important thing to, if unfortunately your employer is not making an investment in your career, although, hey, everybody here is taking time off from work and coming to a conference. And I hope your employers were enabling this to happen, that you didn't have to like take sick leave or vacation time and all of that to do this. So you're already doing this, making an investment in your knowledge and your career, and that may benefit, pay off at your work that you're working at now or in the future. Some of the things with respect to using new tools and old software, I mean, these are some of the things I'm doing, trying to keep the old Fox Pro 2.6 and VB6 apps going. One is that I created virtual machines to keep the dev environments active, right? Because I don't know if VB6 runtime will run on Windows 10, but the development, the IDE, and some of these old third-party tools that I'm using definitely don't. So that's been a real a boon to be able to do that, use virtual machines. And then, it only occurred to me a couple of years ago that I don't have to continue the pattern that I started 20 years ago of copying and pasting, all the directories, and that's how I would back up. Like, I started using Git, right? And using source control, not only to back up, but now every time I make changes, right, I'm not like, oh, I hope I don't break anything, right? Because I can always revert. So there's a modern tool that's really, even like, oh, gee, I wonder if Git will work with Fox Pro 2.6, right? Well, of course it does. It's just files. That's all it cares about. It's just files. So I can use those kind of tools. One of the things that I don't have to deal with this particular situation is dealing with installation and deployment, thank goodness. So they take care of that. And then the other, just a little tip, don't throw away those old books. Because when I have to go and work in VB6, I'm like, oh, I don't, it's not just, oh, gosh, it's so hard to do this because I don't have all the great language that I have available now, but also I just don't remember how to code these things. So, and you can't depend on Google to find all that. So that's just a little tip for dealing with that problem. And I have to say, with respect to putting my Fox Pro code and my VB6 code that I wrote a long time ago when I was still completely self-taught, right? I started coding and I taught myself. We didn't have Pluralsight. We didn't have, the internet to learn all kinds of things. So some of that code is just awful. So I just thought it was funny to share that I put this in the README. If you're looking at this, then I probably died, because why would you look at it otherwise? And if I'm alive, I'm going to die of embarrassment anyway. So about, hey, you should be solving new problems. Like, you're wasting your time working on old problems. Well, sometimes problems don't change, right? This is not my photograph, but I was in this tower. It's in a cathedral in Belgium, a beautiful place. And it's so amazing to see all of, this was high tech when it was built, right? And it's still working, right? They have to go in and polish it up and do things to it every once in a while. But the problem of keeping time hasn't changed, right? We still want to know what time it is, right? And this still does it beautifully, even though, I have my little Fitbit that I can look at and see the time, whatever. It's a little easier than a cathedral. But, sometimes those old problems are not old. They still need to be attended to, and they're still totally relevant. How to get airplanes from point A to point B, or how to schedule seats on an airplane. All of those legacy software that are around. But the big one, as I said before, was this guilt of feeling irresponsible, leaving my client in this situation with. It's not just the old code. We also have the hero problem, right? And for me, in my particular situation, it's an extreme hero problem, because not only am I the hero on the team, I am the team, right? God forbid something happens to me, right? How many times have you said, oh yeah, if I get hit by a bus, right? Like what is going to happen to that software? Even if you're on a team, right? If you have, are people familiar with that hero problem? Like there's that one person on the team who really knows how everything works. Like anytime, like you need to understand something about the old software, you got to go ask that person because they have all of that knowledge. And yeah, they're, oh yeah, a hero, but that's also a dangerous thing, not to have that knowledge spread around. But yeah, again, in my case, it's more like if something happens to me, I fly on a lot of airplanes. Although I have a friend who recently said, we got to stop talking about what if we get killed, right? How about if we say, what if I decide to run off to the circus? Right? I like that's a nicer perspective on that. So besides that, right, like, yeah, my client, that is one thing I worry about a lot. Like if something happens to me, not even if something happens to me, what if I'm at a conference, right, in a different time zone? I'm busy, I'm focused, I'm getting ready for a keynote or giving a keynote, right? And my client sends me an email like, we can't send out our 200 invoices this week because like something happened, I don't know, with FoxPro or the network or something, right? I worry about leaving. Every time I'm going out of town, I'm like, don't make any changes to anything, right? I'll be back in a week, but don't have any emergencies because that's when they happen. They always happen when I'm away and I can't deal with it. So the other big thing is tech debt, technical debt. We worry about that a lot, right? And technical debt is another thing that, people have different perspectives on defining it. It comes from, a banking, financial debt, right? Because it just accumulates and it gets worse and worse and worse if it's not tended to. Again, coming from one of the Legacy Code Rocks podcasts, there was a great podcast with Tim Doherty, and he said tech debt, it doesn't ever go away. Like you can't 100% eliminate it anyway, right? So instead of like going, oh my God, there's old code and we have tech debt, and maybe focus on just maintaining things, right? Keeping on top of it, right? Even if you can't eliminate it, just make sure you're looking to see where the problems are and where you can tweak things and fix things so that it is possible. But he said it's always going to be there, and it isn't irresponsible, right? He says you can manage it responsibly. And again, Michael Feathers had a blog post article called "Is Technical Debt Just a Metaphor?" Right? Asking, hey, this aligns with financial debt. Is it just a metaphor, or is that still a good metaphor? Is it still relevant? And he says it is still relevant, right? The fact that the metaphor is there speaks loudly, right? That people do understand, like they can understand the problems of technical debt by comparing it to financial debt. So that's another interesting blog post to take a look at. So even though, I've got all this experience that I can also share from my own experience working with things, I also need to focus or remember that my experience is still a little different because I'm not on a team, right? I'm supporting something I wrote myself many years ago, and it's kind of different to work on that and think about the problems stemming from that. So there's a lot of other great advice that I'm trying to share here and links where you can go and read more interesting things. So a friend of mine, Stephen Thomas, he actually did a talk at our code camp last month in Vermont called Re-Architecting the Monolith. And a lot of what he was talking about was addressing the problems dealing with the business owners, supporting the developers, right? It wasn't focused on here's how to take a monolith and break it up into microservices. It was the steps you have to do before that, right? In order to get the business ready and willing to let the team make this investment because he's gone through it on a huge product that's actually used by a lot of really big companies. So the idea of completely rebuilding it was really scary, right? So it was really interesting. And he shared a lot of fantastic advice. One of the things that I thought was really important was he talked about the importance of assessing the technical debt, right? And even in a talk on re-architecting monoliths and transforming them into microservices at a talk I attended at NDC in Oslo. I'm trying to remember if it was Sam Newman, who's written great books, and he's got a new one out on going from monolith to microservices, which was about having a plan, right? Because a lot of times what we'll do is we'll just look for the low-hanging fruit and try to, deal with that. But then you've done all of that without having a big picture of what it is that you want to really achieve and making a roadmap for doing that, especially with a big app. So I thought that was important that he was talking about assessing the technical debt. And in there, one of the things that he was able to talk to the business owners about was that technical debt was preventing them from maintaining the application, right? It wasn't maintainable code because of the way it had evolved over the years. And it was making it hard for them to add new features. So, but they were talking about evolving the software in that way as opposed to just, throwing it away and rewriting it, right? So they still, they could evolve it little by little and still have working software for people to use. Another friend of mine, Twitter friend, Matt Eland, he has a blog post or article on Dev that I would recommend. And he also was talking about something that Stephen had been talking about, which is bringing this message to the business owners, right? Because if you can't get their buy-in, you're going to be in real trouble, right? So that's a really, really important thing. So he's got a really good article and talking about his experience, things that did work, things that didn't work. So there's a lot of really good advice in there. So how many people are familiar with the Accelerate project for DevOps? And so this is important. I want to make sure you're all aware of this and just go look it up. It was a big project. They actually have done it again for 2019. It was a big research project. They got data from developers all over the world, and we're really looking at how people's use of DevOps, because it's about the state of DevOps, how people's use of DevOps was reflected in success or maybe failure of projects. So teams that were working well, projects that were going well, how much of these new kind of well, we say it's new, right? How new is DevOps, right? It's just a new word. But a lot of the practices that we have and the newer practices that we have evolved to, how many of them are being used and how that relates to the success or failure of projects. And one of the things that I was kind of looking to see what was being said about technical debt within that report, the 2018 one and the 2019 one. And by the way, Google sponsored this, so you can actually read the whole thing online for free, although they published it as a book as well, so you could get the book. And it really is important. As a matter of fact, some of the people who raised their hand that when I asked who was familiar with it were people I know from the Agile conference world, right? So when I have been at conferences that are in the Agile community, it's like everybody is talking about this all the time. Every talk you go to has references to this book in it, this report and the research. So it's really, really important. So with respect to technical debt, reducing technical debt is something they said has definitely led to developer productivity. And what's really important, because this isn't, people don't think about this enough. But also, when people are more productive on your team, they're happier, they're feeling better about their successes and the importance of what they're doing, right? It's not as frustrating as just going in every day and going, oh, legacy software. This is another really important way you can start not only reducing your technical debt, but also making people on your team or making yourselves really feel much more productive, right? Even if you're using legacy software. I know somebody who said what they did was in their business, and it came from the business owners, so they were supporting this work. They said, let's get down to less than 5% of bugs. Let's go through the bug reports and just start hammering on those, right? And that's another thing that, again, can help. Not only does it help the software by making it more maintainable, but it helps you feel better about what you're working on, right? Maybe you're not implementing a new feature or using the coolest new thing, but isn't getting rid of bugs like really, really satisfying? Almost as satisfying as my favorite thing to do when I'm programming is deleting code. You like deleting code? That is the best. It's funny because like our jobs are to write code, but it's more fun to delete code. Refactoring is another important thing to be able to do. And you can do this in your old software. And I do this anytime, my client says, can you go work in that old Fox Pro app or that old VB6 app? I make sure that whenever I go in, right, I've got a very new perspective on what code should look like and how things flow than when I wrote that thing, 20 plus years ago when I was a completely self-taught programmer. So even though there are times I wake up in the middle of the night and like, I just need to start rewriting that whole app for them because I know that's not the right way to go. But at least when I'm working in there, on working in a particular area, I will look at the code in that spot. And there's always something I can make better, like taking hard-coded SQL out of the application and creating stored procedures and views to replace it with, or just whatever. But I look with my, my knowledge is so much better that I can do that, and it always feels better, right? So next time I go in there, if I have to work on that again, it's going to be a lot easier. I won't have to sit there for who knows how long trying to understand what I was thinking and what this was trying to do. Right, make it more, so it's more readable, more maintainable. Now, so this temptation to just go in and do it everywhere, right? It's really hard to know where to make that investment. But what I've learned is, and what I try to share with people, is that the place to make it is the code that you're going to be touching. So code that's not, you're not actively working on and it works and it's fine. There's no need, if you have only a limited amount of time to do some refactoring, right? You should focus on the areas where you're going to have to come back or somebody's going to have to come back and work on that. So, always like your mother taught you, right? Always leave the room a little nicer, right? when you leave than maybe when you got in there. My friend Nick Toon, who's a very wise guy. He's also a wise guy, as a matter of fact. He's a pretty good joker. But he brings a lot of wisdom and experience to his work and also sharing his work. And he talks about also refactoring from two different angles. One is that you could take that legacy code and make it cleaner, right? Getting rid of some bugs and do some refactoring. And then it'll be easier to build on top of if you need to add new features. But another thing, especially that comes out of domain-driven design, is what we call anti-corruption layers. Is anybody, who here is doing, like, focused and learning from domain-driven design, using some of those practices? Next year, I'm going to come and do a workshop on DDD. So we have something called anti-corruption layers, which is a really nice way to just put a protection between your beautiful code, your new code, and the old code, right? So you can write a layer that's like a translator between them. So you don't have to go in and make changes to the old code, but you can add new code, do new things, new features, and have this kind of translator in between them, right? So the translator knows about what's going on in the old code and what's going on in the new code, but the new and the old don't have to know anything about each other. And that's actually a really good way to protect your new code from, some of the problems in the old code. Accelerate also definitely talks about refactoring, right? Making investments in maintainability. And again, it comes back to reductions in technical debt and some of the side effects of that, and making people feel more productive, having the software be better, having the software be safer, but also having a happier team, right? It's really important to take that into consideration. People don't a lot, although more these days. I don't know if what Michael's topic is going to be here this year, but he's been, like I said, he's been talking about kind of the social and technical connection between software and software teams and the effects they have of each other. So here's a really interesting example somebody shared with me. I actually had reached out on Twitter and said, when I talk about legacy, the experience, the personal experience I bring to the table is really just from being a solo person. And I want to have more, better understanding of what some other people have experienced with enterprise software and big teams. So this was really interesting. They had a very old application that was written in COBOL. Now, I always say, oh, I'm so old and my code is so old, but I've never written COBOL, not that old. And the database was DB2, right? And they're in an industry that is very, very high volume, but low margin, right? So it's really hard for them to justify making the investment, the financial investment, to change this software, because they do lots and lots of transactions, but they don't make a lot of money on each transaction. And it's also a really, really competitive industry, been around for a long time. And they needed to be more modern, right? They could not present their end users with this old COBOL app anymore. So they spent some time really thinking about, what if we just rewrote the whole thing? And they finally decided it just is not feasible, right? We're not going to change the basic workflow of what's going on there. The business rules really haven't changed a lot. It's just they wanted to have more maintainable code, and code that new people could come in and be able to work with, right, instead of COBOL, because that's a pretty limited array of people who know how to use it. Does anybody here know how to program COBOL? Like, you'll always have a job. 600 billion lines of code, was that? Yeah, you'll always have a job if you know COBOL. So that was, they really had to figure out what to do and how to deal with this. And this was a scenario where what they did was they used new tools with old code. So the first thing they did actually was they updated the version of DB2, because it was a really, really old version. But then what they did was they used an ORM to talk to the DB2 app, and then ORM exposed views. So now they're able to read data directly out of access the data directly out of DB2 without having to go through the COBOL app. So that was step one of what they did. The next thing they did was they found a COBOL programmer, right? You'll always have a job. And they wrote an HTTP endpoint into the COBOL app, so now they've got a way to get data out of the database, but they also have a way to interact with the logic that's built into the COBOL app that knows how to persist data into the database, right? Instead of rewriting all that stuff, right? So that becomes like back end. Then they were able to write a beautiful new modern app for the end users to be able to interact with. And then they just hooked it all up. And they've got a CQRS system, right? So they're using modern thinking of CQRS, right? Like got one whole view, a perspective that's all about reading data, and another perspective that's all about writing data. But they're still benefiting from all the logic that the COBOL app knows how to interact with the DB2. But one of the big problems that was really interesting was getting the data out of DB2 was going to be really expensive, and having a way to store it again, right? That was going to be not just expensive, but really problematic. And that was one of the things they were able to protect themselves from by, just adding layers. So to me, thinking about the ACLs, the anti-corruption layers, this HTTP endpoint represents a nice anti-corruption layer, right? The endpoint knows how to talk to the COBOL app so that the new modern system doesn't have to think about that, right? And if anything changes with a new modern system, all they need to do is change a little bit, maybe something in the endpoint, how that processes. So they're protected from having to go into that old app to make changes, but they get the benefit of a new software. So here's, another thing I've seen developers struggle with when I go into clients also is they have a lot of, like, I wrote that code. Like, don't delete my code. Like, why are you saying my code's not good, right? So that's a really hard one to deal with. But another interesting thing that comes out of the Accelerate research is that they found that the businesses that were performing, maybe underperforming, are businesses that were really reliant on so much more proprietary software, right? So being willing to take advantage of third-party software, APIs that are out there, open source, right? So that, it doesn't all have to be your own. So maybe you can replace, look for things that are common, like authentication, right? Authentication, maybe you can use a different authentication API, and then you can kind of relieve your app of that old code. Another thing we talk about a lot for dealing with our legacy code is to add tests into there, right? Because then you can reduce possible side effects if you're doing refactoring, right? Or when you're trying to reduce bugs. One of the things I worry about, because I look at my VB6 app also and think, first of all, like what testing, like we didn't have tests, automated testing with VB6, much less FoxPro 2.6, but there are tools that people have written that I could, put in there. But then I look at the project and I'm like, where would I put the tests, right? Because I don't know what request is going to come down the pipes one of these days. And based on that request, I don't know where the side effects are going to be that I have to protect myself from. So that's, after the fact, that's a little harder to figure out, where you're going to put automated tests to try to help. But there's a lot of talk about, a lot of IP on approaches to doing that. I'm just saying with my old app, it's hard for me to perceive that. But this is another thing. If you think about the fact that Michael's 2004 book defined legacy code as code without tests, there's plenty in there of advice about thinking about adding tests in after the fact. I just wanted to talk a little bit about this problem. Somebody was sharing a story with me about what he referred to as the death march legacy app. Does anybody feel that aligns with the work that they're doing? That would be sad if you feel that way. But this was a team that really felt that way. They had an old app, was really old, ASP.NET, right? Okay, so it was like 20 years old, not 30 years old or 15 years old or something. But it was old and it was very problematic. There was a lot of bugs in there. The users were not happy using it, but the business was not willing to invest in having the developers work on it, or fix it, update it, anything. So there was a big political problem there. So this person who was the dev lead on the team really had to figure out, you know, what do we do? Because we need to have this app keep working. The business has told us, don't work on it. Nobody was, there was no commitment to replace it or update it. But it was still, the business was still dependent on it, right? So that's a really bad situation. That's a really, really bad situation. So what this guy did as the dev lead was, first of all, one of the important things he did was he said, I really wanted to encourage a positive attitude instead of every day everybody coming in and going, oh my God, this is the worst. Why do we want to work on it? So try to really focus on, he was really focusing on positive things that were happening on the team as they were working on this. I should have put these in a different order. Maybe start with getting outside perspective. That always helps. I've had this experience a number of times. When somebody's paying me a lot of money to come in and talk to their team or give them advice, they're going to listen, right? So sometimes that's really effective, right? Because business is not willing to listen. I mean, there's all kinds of inherent problems there, right? Like you just say, maybe just run away. But not everybody has that ability, right? You don't have the flexibility to just run away from a job if you can't find another one. So getting outside perspective, he said in this situation was really helpful. It didn't sway the politics, but it helped the team. And they made a commitment to improve this anyway, to work on improvements and to start getting rid of bugs and do a little refactoring, right? Even though the business didn't know what was going on. So they're like, you know, we're going to do it anyway because it needs to happen. This needs to be better, and we need to feel like we're doing something to help this software, something to help the company and to help the end users, right? So they did work on, you know, getting rid of bugs and doing things. So thinking about celebrating wins and encouraging positive attitude. So they were doing things. He was enabling the team to learn about, you know, more testing practices. They started learning about source control. They started learning about all kinds of modern tooling and techniques, refactoring methods, things like that they were using in there. So even though they might not be using the latest, greatest version of, you know, .NET or JavaScript or whatever, they were still working in this old code, but they were able to still learn new tools and build new skills when they were working with this old software. And so that also gave them some wins. And he said, you know, every time there was a win, we would celebrate it. Like, you know, we are being productive. We're making a difference. We're learning new things. We got down to, you know, we got lots of bugs out of the system, things like that. So, you know, so this is unfortunate, you know, an unfortunate position to be in, right? But some people are in that position. He also said this was very helpful to think of the serenity prayer, right? Like I can't, if you can't change it, just, you know, just try to give yourself a positive attitude about it and understand that, you know, you're maybe not going to be able to change the politics of this, but we'll find another way to be able to deal with this. And then, you know, if this is an option, I'm not saying you need to live with this situation. Okay, enough, kid. You know, again, sometimes it's not an option to leave, right? But if it's a toxic situation and you have an opportunity to go, you know, that is definitely something that needs to happen. I think being the fact that I'm focused in .NET, I think it's, and there's people here doing .NET programming, I think it's important to consider the fact that your old WinForms and WPF apps just got an extended life by the fact that they're supported on .NET 3. So you can think about that also with respect to these applications, right? They just became modern applications again, right? Like WinForms. I love WinForms. I love Windows Forms. I feel a lot more comfortable working with them than in WPF. And it is really kind of funny today too, like client-side application. Where do we start, right, in .NET? I also just do want to report that with my client, we do have a light at the end of the tunnel finally. So I've been doing what I can to support them so that they stay in business. And in the meantime, we've got some new systems being built slowly, right, and carefully, and it's going to take time. So I still have to warn them when I'm going out of the country. But I do see light at the end of the tunnel too for them, which is really great for this, this they are 100% dependent on me situation, which was untenable. So just to wrap up, one of the things I really thought was important, again, I know you're getting lots of great advice from different sessions at this conference about how to get rid of your monoliths, right? How to use microservices, all of that. But I wanted to make sure that people feel better about the work they're doing, especially if you're in the situation where you're coming to a conference and learning about all these new things, and then you're going back to work on the same old stuff. You won't be able to use the new stuff yet in the work that you're doing. So it doesn't have to be awful. There are lots of opportunities to make this legacy software better, even if you can't replace it, even if you can't, take a section out and replace it with a microservice, right? You can still do a lot to make it productive and make it better and feel like you're making a difference and learn new things, even if you're working in old code and old languages. And as you saw at the beginning, okay, maybe when we got into the 10 and 20-year-old apps, there's not a lot of people working on those. But the 5-year-old apps, a lot of people, right? I think that was like still 80, 75, or 80% of the room, people who are working on apps that are 5 years old or more. And as Eric Evans says, we should honor our legacy software more, recognize the fact that so much legacy software is still doing its job in the world, right? And again, I like to remind myself, I must have done a good job writing that software. It's still running that company, and they haven't found anything better in all these years, right? With all kinds of new things available to them, right? But sometimes I say I unfortunately did way too good of a job writing that software because it will not die, right? You can go in and you can make improvements to it. You can refactor. You can attack some of the bugs. Right, you can add tests maybe, and also you can add new tools like they did with that, how they extended that COBOL and DB2 app, right? So that's in a black box now, the COBOL app, but now they're working on new modern apps kind of outside of it. And also, hopefully, there is a future where you'll be able to evolve this legacy app or rewrite it, right? So you can still plan for it. And doing some of these things to improve it, if it's going to be an evolution to a new version of the app, having the code be maintainable is really important. That's a really good investment to make in it. So that is what I wanted to talk to you about. Let's see if I left 1 minute for questions. I don't see any questions on Cyto anyway. Was I supposed to tell you? Oh, I got Cyto running just in case. Anyway, so that is it. I hope even though you're going to go and learn all kinds of new things and new software, that those of you who are still, going to be going back to work on your old software, feel good about that and feel like that is still really productive, and there's a lot that you can do to make it good and to still improve your careers as developers. And well, thank you very much and have a great day.